Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we start today? Well, I am going to go straight to a bit of strategizing. I'm going to talk, I'm going to communicate what Mick Ryan, a former Australian general, he's not a former Australian, he's still Australian. Uh, he says he's an expert, an author, written on strategy in war and adaptation, all sorts of things. He says one of the best ways to defeat an adversary is to target their strategy. To do that, we must understand it. Therefore, in my very latest article, I explore Russian strategy and its various components for its continuing Ukraine invasion in 2023. Okay, let's see what he has to say. So, the plan for the 10-day lightning conquest of Ukraine, as described in a recent Russia report, was, in the main, a failure. The Russians didn't make considerable gains in the south and east. They did make considerable gains, but their northern campaign was a military disaster. Despite battlefield setbacks in the north and northeast of Ukraine, Putin and his defense and intelligence chiefs proceeded to assemble an alternative theory of victory for their invasion and attempted takeover of Ukraine. First, they prioritized their military operations, avoiding concurrent multi-front offensives. From April 2022, they focused on an eastern offensive, allowing them to husband remaining military forces for ops in the Donbass. Another element of the evolution of Russian strategy after early failures was holding Ukraine's south, including Ukraine's seaports. This is a key element of Putin's evolved strategy because it offered the opportunity to strangle Ukraine economically. Okay, I'm going to stop here and just rewind and remind you of what happened right at the beginning of the war. So, at the beginning of the war, Russia invaded and they had a plan for deposing the Ukrainian government over a couple of days, 2 to 5 days, and then they were going to spend about 15 days clearing up the rest of the country after deposing the government. We know this from plans that were found in certain places. We know this from intelligence. We know this. They had parade uniforms in their vehicles when they came in, expecting it to all be sewn up and then to go on parade. They had only rations for 5 days and a whole number of different things. They had a lot of Rosgvardia, who are internal police people rather than actual soldiers. So they weren't prepared at all for a war. They were told, the soldiers were told, we know this from POWs, soldiers were told that they would be welcomed with open arms and they're being braced by the Ukrainian people. That the Russian commanders must have thought that in order to tell them that, because there's no point telling them a complete lie. That has no practical value. So they must have believed this. So there was just a massive information intelligence breakdowns that meant the people at the top didn't have the correct information to make the right decisions. I could have told you, sitting in my office, in my study, back at that time, knowing what little I did, that never would have happened, right? So if I knew more than Putin at the time for making that decision, then something was drastically wrong. Anyway, the Russians ended up being in Ukraine accidentally in a war, right? Because they didn't plan for a war, they weren't prepared for a war, and they ended up being in a war. So then it was like, okay, well, they had to adapt. What are our plans now? Goodness me, we were going to depose Zelensky and assassinate him, and that's never going to happen. We can't even get near Kyiv. So they still tried to get near Kyiv, and then at some point they realized that's never going to happen. We don't have the troops. We don't have the capability to do what we planned. They're fighting really, really hard, and actually, the West is starting to get behind them. So then they sort of started retreating from these areas around Kyiv and the north, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and concentrating on what they could achieve, which was the south. Economically, they wanted Odessa really, so they moved through. They got Kherson quite quickly. They marched up through Crimea, and that was relatively easy. They got Melitopol pretty easily, and then Mariupol was very difficult, but they eventually got that. But each passing month, their objectives appeared to change as they realised what they couldn't do. So they had the idea for basically a whole kind of east of the country, I would say, probably through Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kharkiv, up there. And then they realized, oh, we can't do that. So they tried these pincer movements, but that didn't really work. They're still in Bakhmut trying to get Bakhmut. Bakhmut was part of the Izium pincer movement. So coming down through Izium, up through Bakhmut, that kind of failed. And it got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where now they're kind of like people are trying to work out what their objectives are. Is it just to hold on to what they've got? Are they trying to take this Seversk, Bakhmut area, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk? Is it the Donbass? Do they want the whole of Donetsk now? Is it still the case, as some say, that Putin still has a maximalist agenda that he wants the whole of Ukraine? The point is, they had to adapt to the fact that they were just not able to do remotely what they originally planned, and they had to make adaptation on top of adaptation on top of adaptation. So, um, just to repeat what he said here, another element of the evolution of Russian strategy after early failures was holding Ukraine's south, including Ukraine's seaports. This is a key element of Putin's evolved strategy because it offered the opportunity to strangle Ukraine economically. Absolutely, and I get that. A third adaptation to Russia's strategy was accepting that this would not be a lightning war. So they're expecting 15 days, and eventually now they're in it for the long haul. This is a long, protracted war, and in fact, their success now is, I think, contingent upon the fact, or contingent upon the idea for them that it has to be a long war, because that's the only way the West will get bored and pull out and not help. If it's NATO and the West against Russia, Russia are going to lose. It's just, they must know that, right? So it's like, how can we beat the West without actually beating them? Well, they need to get bored of this, and they need to have problems elsewhere, Taiwan, this, that, whatever. And so you might see Lavrov going around the world sowing discord around the world to kind of distract the West from helping Ukraine. The evolved Russian strategy appeared to embrace the idea that Western populations and politicians would eventually tire of the war. In September and October 2022, a series of Ukrainian attacks forced the Russians again to reconsider and adapt their strategy. This did not cause a reassessment of Russia's strategic objectives, however. Putin retained his maximalist objective to subjugate Ukraine. As Mark Galeotti writes, quote, Putin's war aims have remained constant and continue to center on the destruction of Ukraine as an independent state capable of joining the EU or NATO, the breaking of the will of its people to resist and will of the West. But because of Ukrainian battlefield success and the increasing quality of Ukrainian weapons in the last 4 months of 2022, Russia had to evolve its approach. Over the last few months, Russia has adapted to its strategy to achieve Putin's war aims. The Russian strategy for its subjugation of Ukraine is likely to have 7 components in the coming year. These are informational, command and leadership, military, diplomatic, national mobilization, economic, and adaptation. Information warfare. So, Russian narratives, including information operations to retain domestic support for the war and influence foreign populations, have been part of Russia's strategy from before the war. They will continue in 2023. I'm going to talk a little bit about that a bit later. Command and leadership. This month, Putin appointed loyalist General Gerasimov to lead the Russian invasion forces in Ukraine. According to Michael Kaufman, this was a resolution of competing visions with the Russian military for how to win this war. Gerasimov must conduct battlefield offensives and force a more unified approach between the Russian military and private military companies such as the Wagner Group. He must also oversee and integrate targeting strategic targets in Ukraine and command the Russian military. Offensive military action. The deployment of tens of thousands of mobilized soldiers, as well as the recruitment of thousands of convicts to serve in the Wagner Group, has stabilized the Russian position in Ukraine over the winter. So it was precarious, if you remember before. They'd just suffered the lightning counteroffensive up the north. Kherson had just fallen. But actually, the mobilization did, throwing those people on the front line, getting the convicts, has stabilized that front line. And I think you can't contest that. But military manpower initiatives alone will not win this war for Russia. Gerasimov was not appointed to command the Russian invading force just to defend captured ground. This will necessitate offensive action from the Russian army. And we're kind of seeing elements of that at the moment. There's something going on. They're prodding and probing all up and down the line. Diplomacy. The diplomatic efforts of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have been a key part of Russian strategy in this war. He has undertaken multiple overseas trips as part of these efforts, as we saw from visiting South Africa, as I mentioned in yesterday's video. Belarus is likely to be continuing focal point for Russian diplomacy. Putin visited Belarus in December 2022 for discussions with Lukashenko. Countries like China also remain vital for Russia and will be a focus for Russia's efforts. National mobilization. An important element of evolved Russian strategy has been the mobilization of the Russian people and industry for the war. This has seen at least 300,000 Russian inducted into the Russian military. At the same time, Russia has attempted to mobilize its industry to support the war. And there are rumors, as I spoke about this morning, rumors that that will be ramped up if the next wave of mobilization does indeed take place in February. Economic warfare. The Russian invasion has had a profound effect on Ukraine's economy. This is a deliberate part of Russia's strategy to constrain the ability of Ukraine to generate revenue while imposing costs through civilian deaths and destruction of infrastructure. The objective for Russia is to ensure Ukraine has limited capacity to underpin its sovereignty with sources of income. Russia needs to keep its economy functioning while it gradually throttles Ukraine's. It is a critical element of their strategy. Adaptive strategy. So Russia has shown a capacity to learn and adapt their strategy when faced with battlefield setbacks and Western interventions that have enhanced Ukraine's capacity. Adaptation will remain an important part of their strategy in 2023. Putin's view of being able to outweight the West may be another of his poor strategic assumptions, and if Putin's strategy this year fails, it may just be the start of a cascading series of catastrophic events for Putin and Russia. Owen Matthews has written, quote, "He gained a fifth of Ukraine and increased the size of Russia by 0.5%. The price of his illusions was not only thousands of lost lives, but also a lost future for Russia. There is a lot riding on Putin's revised strategy in 2023." So that's a really interesting thread, and it's talking to this idea that in order to combat Russia effectively, you need to understand what they're trying. You need to understand their objectives here, and that does appear to be um, something that Mick Ryan here has had a good stab at. Trying to get inside Putin's mind is obviously a difficult pastime. I'm actually going to move what I was going to talk about at the end to here because I think it fits in well with that. So in less than a year, Putin, the master strategist, went from having Europe by the throat in terms of energy to completely losing a market Russia had spent 3 generations building. Quote, "People will never want to rely on Russia again," says Daniel Yergin. So here's an article that this isn't so much Putin and Russia's strategy with the war and with Ukraine in and of itself. This is his kind of geopolitical strategy and trying to control the West. So this article starts off talking about, I mean, first of all, it says Putin destroyed in a year an energy business that took 3 generations to build. As it turns out, Russia needed Europe far more than Europe needed Russia. He talks about this advert, and I showed it to you actually. The advert that was showing that people in Britain were freezing, couldn't have any energy, really cold in their houses, and then it went to Russia where it was all warm and using the internet, everything was fine. And then someone, was so amazed from Britain they came over to Russia, some beautiful girl, and then the bloke had all these beautiful women because he's got um, energy and heat and all that, and it was absolutely terrible advert. But more than anything, it was actually in the end just plain wrong. So it was, and I'll join this article here. So it was the Kremlin's prophecy of what they were sure the winter of 2023 would bring to Europe: a brutal reckoning for their support of Ukraine and betrayal of their energy overlord, Russia. It turned out it was mostly hubris. A warm winter, low energy prices, and Europe's rapid turn away from the Russian energy have revealed that the balance of power wasn't quite as durable as the Kremlin had predicted. And then we saw the price cap brought in. And just to recap, it was a measure designed by the Biden administration to simultaneously incentivize Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, to both keep pumping oil so as not to create an energy crisis. So if you stopped Russia from pumping oil and stopped that supply entirely, you would have an energy crisis where everyone would be fighting over smaller and smaller amounts of the natural resources, and the price would go through the roof, and it would be an absolute economic catastrophe. So they needed to manipulate Russia in a way that allowed Russia to still keep pumping oil and there to be enough oil, the supply of oil around, considering that OPEC being pretty difficult. So you saw Biden releasing strategic reserves, you saw lots of goings on. But in the end, people were a bit skeptical about this price cap thing, but in the end, it worked. It seems to have worked really well. So to both keep pumping oil so as not to create an energy crisis at the moment when the world was in an inflationary spiral, all the while preventing the Kremlin from manipulating prices to fund its own ruthless invasion of Ukraine. And as Daniel Yergin, who's the world's preeminent expert on Russian oil, has said, it's worked much better than would have been expected. What was originally a topic for an economics graduate seminar has turned into a rather clever piece of statecraft. And it goes to talk about how it's working, but essentially, how the price cap. So the price cap's set at $60 a barrel for the Russian oil, whereas the price of a barrel of other oil is much higher, and it just restricts Russia from being able to get as much money for their oil as they would like, and they're budgeted for around $70 a barrel, and they're getting between 30 and 40 at the moment, or 30 and 50. So the article goes on at this writing. Brent is selling for about $86 per barrel, while Urals, the Russian, is selling beneath the price cap. Though according to Jurgen, it's been fluctuating around the high 30s to low 40s. We think, and this is partly because they pocket the difference. So they might be selling it a little bit higher, but someone is pocketing that difference and putting it out into offshore accounts and whatnot. But that's not going to be benefiting Russia either. So, Russian oil is selling for maybe for $30 to $40 a barrel less than they had budgeted for. So their entire budget is which is a main source of income. This oil is that absolutely up the creek now. So, according to Bloomberg, the article continues, which has been following these developments closely, there are now really only three main purchasers of Russian seaborne crude: Turkey, China, and India. There are not that many places where Russia can sell its crude anymore, Jurgen told me. It's made people more cautious in dealing with Russian oil. There's enough ambiguity about violating the price cap that people will continue being very cautious. Russia has tried to get around various sanctions by amassing a shadow fleet of 200 or so ships, but that's still not enough to cover all the oil it used to export. To do that, Russia would need 3 to 4 years to build enough ships to carry all of its oil, and that's if money were no object. For 2023, Russia has pegged its budget on Urals selling at $70 per barrel, $10 above the price cap, and far above what it's been selling for in the last 2 months. By one estimate, tax revenues on oil and gas production in December 2022 fell by 41% year over year. Revenues from oil exports in the same period fell by a third. According to another report, the Russian government is losing 160 million euros per day because of the price cap. According to this same report, Russia will lose another 120 million euros a day when the European embargo on refined Russian petroleum products like diesel goes into effect on February the 5th. So that means that it could be in February that Russia would be losing 280 million euros per day. Now that's money that would have gone somewhere, that would have been spent on. So yeah, I'm sure money would have gone in someone's pocket to some large degree, but a lot of that money would have been spent on stuff inside Russia, welfare, education, um, R&D projects, all the sorts of things that keep your society running, that keep the cogs of your social and economic mechanisms oiled. But that money is now not going to be there. So, how long can Russia last before the nation implodes? It looks like they're going to put the country on a war footing entirely, and that it'll be interesting to see how the public take to that. So to continue, Alex Clement, who's an analyst with the Eurasia Group, says both sides are circling around each other but unwilling to administer the death blow, because the death blow to the other guy really hurts you too. So here's the idea that if you set that price cap too low, then yeah, you can kill off Russia, but in killing off Russia, actually, you're going to create some crisis yourself, economically speaking. So it's a really delicate balancing act to hurting Russia enough to cripple them so they stop the war, but not dealing a death blow, because that will come around and bite you on the ass. So, but at first time in a long time, Russia's economy is running at a deficit. In 2022, the deficit was nearly 50 billion, or 2.3% of its GDP in 2023. The Kremlin is planning on a similar deficit, and if Ural stays at $70 a barrel and Russia hits its oil production targets, a very big if, which is why even the Russian finance minister said he expects the 2023 deficit to be even bigger than expected. Among the many massive miscalculations Putin made in the run up to the invasion of Ukraine, that the Ukrainians wouldn't resist, that the West wouldn't punish him, that the Biden administration was too weak, perhaps paramount was the notion that Europe would never survive another winter, a winter without Russian oil and gas. Russia, the message was, had Europe by the balls. Yet, almost a year into the war, the energy stranglehold Russia thought it had on Europe is more of an awkward side hug. Russia spent 3 generations building a business out of selling energy to Europe that Putin destroyed in a year. And it turned out that Russia needed Europe far more than Europe needed Russia. Putin believed the vast oil and gas fields gave Russia irrevocable superpower status and that using it as a cudgel on his clients would never backfire. Quote, he has certainly overplayed his hand, said Jurgen. He went into this quite confident that Russia was an energy superpower and that this in and of itself gave it enormous political power. That was an overestimate. I think Russia will remain an energy supplier, but it will never be an energy superpower again. It has lost its credibility as a supplier. People will never want to rely on Russia again. I think he squandered the geopolitical power that came from Russia's energy position. Added Jurgen, people start wars and then they don't turn out the way they thought they would. Absolutely. So this has not turned out the way Putin thought it would, because actually he got the strategy wrong. He miscalculated Ukraine. He miscalculated the West and the strength of unity in the EU, the strength of the Biden administration for being strong on Russia. They would have looked back at 2014 in Crimea and thought, hey, we can do anything here. Let's attack Ukraine. And it's going to be a bit like it was in 2014. And actually, that didn't happen. UK were really strong to begin with. The EU have been really strong and unified. And in fact, this has given strength to the EU. It's given strength to NATO. NATO has now gained arguably 2 powers. And everything that Putin has predicted or wanted out of this war has not happened. This will go down in history, I'm fairly sure, as one of the single worst decisions in modern history. It just has to. Anyway, moving on to something slightly different. This is Ruslan Pukov, who is a Russian defense analyst, argues that the delivery of Abrams tanks could seriously aggravate the situation at the front for Russian forces because even export variants of the M1A2 is significantly better than existing Russian tanks in serial production. And he's written a report which has been sort of translated by someone here. But Rob Lee says, this doesn't include T-90M, which aren't in serial production. He says Russian tanks are using old Soviet-era ammunition, which is sufficient against, say, T-64, T-72, T-80 tanks at short ranges. But NATO tanks could engage them at long distances, putting them at a disadvantage. So you could, again, it's a bit like the self-propelled guns, where you can hit Russian artillery and they can't hit you back because they don't have the range you do. So if some of these tanks have a greater range than the Russian tanks, and the Russian tanks will struggle to penetrate the armor at those distances, then there's something to be said for the advantage of these Western vehicles. But he also says that Russia lacks a 3rd-generation ATGM, so anti-tank guided missile, like the Javelin, and the Russian forces don't have enough Kornets. Instead, older Konkurs and the Fagot ATGM are the bulk of Russia's ATGMs. So they don't even have good enough ATGMs to hit and take out Western tanks like the Abrams. He says that 30 to 50 tanks is unlikely to affect the situation, but 200 to 300 could be a significant operational factor. He says much will depend on Russian producers of anti-tank systems. So that's a really interesting Russian view on all these Western tanks coming along. This is a view that I completely agree with. Ukraine needs longer range missiles before Russia sends reinforcements, said Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy head of the main intelligence. He clarified that Russia began to transfer military cargo throughout the territory of the Russian Federation, in particular to the southern regions. It's not just about hitting, and this is from a CNN article, it's not just about hitting these trains of cargo knocking around Russia and Belarus, although that would be useful to hit, but also they need these longer range missiles because the Russians have adapted to the HIMARS, and so they're now putting their troop accumulations, and not entirely successfully. You'd still need to accumulate troops somewhere. You can't put them all individually. So there are still places within 84 kilometers, but large troop and supply accumulations are in the 100-kilometer mark away from the front line. And so if they are going to mobilize another couple of 100,000 troops, they need these longer range missiles to be usable by then. You need to be able to hit those troop accumulations at 100, 150 kilometers back and cause real problems for the Russians. So it's now, now, now. I mean, obviously it is, but it definitely needs to be before the mobilization takes place. Um, Now, you may or may not have heard about what happened the other day in good old Sweden. So Sweden has a bit of a right-wing government in place at the moment, and it's quite a ripe place for anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant sort of sentiments. And there's been a reaction in Sweden over the last sort of few years, such that they've now voted in Swedish Democrats and the government. And anyway, Sweden and Finland are trying to join NATO. Turkey are saying, yeah, not so much, and there's that whole issue going on. Well, then the other day, someone burnt a Quran in these demonstrations, these organized right-wing demonstrations in Sweden, and Turkey went ballistic about this, and they were not happy at all. So, right wing Quran burning in Sweden enrages Turkey and throws a new wrench in the Nordics' NATO bid. It's now been 8 months since Sweden and Finland declared their intent to join NATO, a move that upended the country's long-standing policies of non-alignment following nearby Russia's full-scale invasion. While most of the organisation's members want to fast-track the new joiners' memberships, tensions and a fresh spat between Sweden and Turkey threaten to extend that waiting time by a lot longer. And so, yeah, so this guy actually came across, he's a Danish Swedish guy, Paludan, I think, came across and burnt a Quran. And Turkey have now said, and that's going to play into Russia's hands. Well, it turns out, is this a definite connection? Well, there is some connection between the guy that did it. Well, not the guy that did it, but the guy that paid for him to come over from Denmark. He's a Danish Swede, this guy, and burned the Quran. The protests that took place on Saturday caused backlash in Turkey and led to President Erdogan saying that Sweden shouldn't expect Ankara support for its NATO membership bid. Swedish media suggest that Moscow was behind the Quran burning, using Frick, who has worked as a freelancer for RT and its subsidy Rutli. So this is Chang Frick, who's a Swedish right-wing journalist who is also a bit of a Russia lackey by the looks of it. So he's previously worked for RT and its subsidiary. The timing of the event is particularly significant as it came shortly before the planned visit of Sweden's defense minister to Turkey, which was cancelled after the protest was announced. So this is played into Russia's hands completely. But it does look like there's something dodgy going on. Swedish media learned that while Paludan, who also holds Swedish citizenship, travelled to Stockholm specifically for the protest, his application fee for the demonstration permit was paid by Frick. Paludan confirmed to the media that the idea to burn a Quran was proposed to him by Frick. He also guaranteed that the damage that Paludan could sustain as a result of the protest would be covered. Frick, who is known for his pro-Russian position, is an owner of the news site Nyheter Idag and presenter of the Swedish Democrat channel Riks, which is financed by the Sweden Democrats Party. Although they've sort of said that they weren't involved in all this stuff. So, I mean, dodgy, pro-Russia sentiments going on big time here, and it looks pretty suspect that the guy that has caused this division between Sweden and Turkey is being financed by a pro-Russian Swedish journalist. Frick denies having any ties with RT since 2014. He confirmed paying for Paladin, but claimed he did not believe the protest had jeopardized Sweden's NATO application. But of course, freedom of speech and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Its latest report said that Frick also paid for Paladin's plane ticket to Sweden, but both Paladin and Frick deny it. Interesting. I don't know how much that is going to be a part of what's happening. Whether this was masterminded by Russia, I don't know, but it's benefiting Russia, and Russia seemed to have some kind of involvement. Now, talking about the information space, Ukraine, the latest podcast, had a really interesting interview with someone who is an expert on disinformation and democracy and so on. Dr. Ivana Stradner, an expert on Russia's propaganda warfare. And here's what she has to say. I thought it's really interesting. I'd advise listening to all of it.
So there are so many challenges, but the sooner we understand those challenges and have courage to overcome those obstacles, the easier it will be to counter Russia. Because one thing I will tell you, Russia might be losing on the ground in Ukraine, but Russia is not losing in information space.
It's interesting you say that, because that was actually going to be my next question, which is that the conventional narrative is that Russian propaganda, obviously once considered the most effective in the world, has arguably largely failed in the war it's waged online and elsewhere, at least in the early months of the war. I just wondered whether you agreed with that analysis.
I firmly disagree with that analysis. And this is why. Who stated that? Scholars and policymakers and people on Twitter, or people in Africa or Venezuela, for example? Because the world does not revolve around Brussels, London, or Washington, D.C., with all due respect. And people on Twitter might not believe that monkeypox was created by CIA or our Department of Defense, which is exactly what the Ministry of Defense claimed, that we developed monkeypox in one of our biolabs. That's what they openly claimed just a few months ago. So people, like you and me might not believe in that thing, but I can guarantee you that people in Africa firmly believe that the food crisis stemmed from the US, that the United States is responsible for this war because allegedly we are waging a proxy war. They do believe in the role of biolabs. So the information space is very wide, and Russia is not only targeting the United States, but Russia is targeting everywhere possible to create chaos in places such as Africa, where information operations have been on a constant over the past decade, let alone what Russia is doing in places such as Venezuela or Asia, using their RT or Sputnik, inauthentic accounts like bloggers or, for example, agents of influence, social media influencers. It's a very, very wide space with numerous tools that Russia has at its disposal to discredit the West. And look, this is nothing new, because even during the Cold War, I always love to use this example, and this is one of my favorite disinformation campaigns, and I'll tell you why. When during the Cold War, actually, Russia was spreading disinformation that the United States, it was called like Operation Denver, that we developed HIV, that CIA actually developed HIV specifically to target Black people and use that as an ethnic weapon. So I'll just give you a very concrete example how it works nowadays. The messages are very similar. What is difference? The difference is...
And you see this kind of conspiracy theory thinking just falls on fertile ground. There's so many people that suck this up around the world. I have fought against conspiracy thinking in my time online, in my writing, and actually in talks I've given. I remember seeing Rob Brotherton, who's a PhD. Is a doctor on who is researched conspiracy thinking, and it's like you believe one, you're likely to believe more type thing. And I've got some fantastic anecdotes to just show you how I won't sidebar now, but how the human mind works with so many of us are very susceptible to believing these kind of things. And so when someone like Russia comes up with this stuff and lets it fly, it often falls on fertile ground.
The media space, that now with social media you can spread such disinformation super easy. So for example, the Russian...
They've done lots of research on Facebook to show that Facebook false information travels 5 times faster than true information on Facebook, as an example, and how we share stuff. It's so sad that the truth is up against it.
Government openly claims that we used bioweapons specifically to target the Slavic people. They openly stated that. Then the second thing is, for example, they claim that we developed bioweapons where we use actually migratory birds to deliver such bioweapons. And then they became a little bit more tech advanced, so they accused us of using drones. And I just use one very concrete example.
And you can bet your bottom dollar, I would bet my house that Russia were largely involved in this whole like COVID vaccine, anti-vax kind of movement, particularly in America. And then you just had people talking about Microsoft and Bill Gates and microchips in your bloodstream and all this absolute bollocks. But there's a lot of people who are willing to suck that all up, and it feeds into the division and polarization of, in this case, America. Russia are going to be feeding that. Have been feeding that for the last decade now. We're coming on for a decade of meddling in the 2016 election, meddling in the 2020 election, meddling in the Brexit election, and unfortunately for us, like our government refused to run a report. They refused to release a report on uh, Russia meddling in Brexit because they knew it would undermine the Brexit vote. And they reckon, and I understand that because it would have done, and then it would have had the whole shenanigans of going through the vote again, and you wouldn't guarantee it winning again, etc., etc. So I understand why they did that, but they have purposefully not looked into that problem because they know that problem is there and it exists. And so Russia are in the information space. And what she goes on to say, and I won't play you anymore, but she basically goes on to say, as I said to you yesterday, we need to take the war back to Russia by spreading information back, but messaging, not about disinformation, but positive messaging and narratives about X, Y, and Z, that then they have to fight, right? And in being on the defensive, they are unable to be on the offensive. They don't have the resources to be on the offensive. So it's incumbent upon the West and Ukraine and allies to just be attacking or fighting in the information space rather than always being on the defensive and trying to firefight all these fires that pop up around the world in terms of the narrative and the lies that Russia are successfully spreading. And honestly, like I know enough bots on this thread, I've come across enough bots online, and I've seen stuff repeated in British politics in quite sort of fairly mundane, well, national politics, where I've been sure that is Russian involvement there, and I can see it. And these are, and actually, I've seen certain breakdowns of Twitter activity in terms of British politics and the involvement of Russian bots in that, and it's like that is fascinating and it's scary and it's dangerous, and we don't do enough to fight that. So there you go. Just be warned. Okay, moving on to Zelensky. Really, last couple of things really quickly. Zelensky, Putin is nobody to me. This is again, like this is a narrative, isn't it? In a recent interview with Sky News, President Zelensky told Kay Burley that Russia's Vladimir Putin is nobody to him following the full-scale invasion. He has no interest in meeting with him. Uh, I kind of like that, which is like I know we should be negotiating and coming to a diplomatic endpoint at some point, but no, he doesn't interest me. He's nobody. And Putin, he has this like big man, strong man leadership kind of image, and I think just dismissing him as irrelevant in this kind of context is an interesting tactic. Whether that will find any purchase within Russia, I doubt it. But yeah, I quite like that. And just to leave you with, of course, today there was a huge missile attack. The latest is that Russia launched 55 missiles, 47 were shot down. But not only that, actually, I think 5 didn't find their target or something. So the air defense forces and means of the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed 47, 20 of them in the area of the capital. In addition, three did not reach their targets. So that meant that only 5 missiles hit their targets. 5 out of 55, 1 in 11, less than 10%, uh, is not great stats, but those 5 are still finding still dealing some damage and causing issues for the energy infrastructure and what else ever else they've hit. Anyway, thank you. That's today's Ukraine War Update Extra. Hopefully that was of interest to you. Please like, subscribe, and share. And please, all the ways you support the channel are massively appreciated. Thank you so much, and keep up those conversations in the threads. They are truly enriching. So thank you. I'll speak to you tomorrow.